Friday the 13th, Part 2, the novelization by Simon Hawke. Chapter 1, 5 Years Later. "Alright, keep your eyes peeled, I think we're getting close," said Jeff, pushing his cap back on his head and watching the street signs as they entered the town of Crystal Lake. He drove the midnight blue four-wheel drive with the raised body very slowly, being careful not to exceed the posted speed limit of 25 miles per hour. He had bought it for his 18th birthday after taking several years to save up enough money for the down payment. It was still brand new, not even 1,000 miles on it yet. He knew that a lot of these small towns boosted their revenues at the expense of tourists and vacationers coming through. City drivers who were accustomed to a faster pace and therefore had a hard time driving slowly in the country. His father had co-signed the loan on the condition that he keep a clean driving record, and Jeff intended to keep up his end of the bargain. Beside him, Sandra, a pretty 17-year-old blonde, checked the directions she had scrawled on a piece of loose-leaf paper. She glanced up, looking through the windshield, brushing her thick curly hair out of her eyes as she checked for landmarks. "Hey, there's a gas station," she said, recognizing one. Jeff pulled over to the curb across the street from the gas station. "Come on, let's call Ted," he said, opening the door. Ted had told them to get to the service station in town and call him from there so he could come out and meet them. Otherwise, he warned them they'd only get hopelessly confused. "You can get lost on those little back roads," he had told them. "Believe me, I know. Just give me a call from the Gulf station when you get into town and I'll come out and get you. You can't miss it. Just look for the big old orange sign." Jeff and Sandra ran across the street to the phone booth in the gas station. Jeff fished around in the pockets of his jeans until he found a quarter. He deposited it and dialed Ted's number. Sandra put her hands in the pockets of her khaki hiking shorts and took a look around the town of Crystal Lake. Ted had been right when he told them there wasn't much to see. "Oh, it's a little old hick town," he had said. "But what the hell, it's home, right?" Actually, it was only a summer home that had belonged to Ted's parents. Ted used to spend his vacations here, but recently his parents preferred to get away to Europe. Ted usually worked at counseling jobs at various camps, so the house in Crystal Lake was closed most of the year. It was on the market, but apparently there was no great rush to buy homes in this town. Looking around, Sandra thought she could understand why the town looked dead. Still, the prospect of spending a couple of weeks at the counselor's training center and then having a big empty house to play in for a few days before the summer camp season got started seemed like a lot of fun. They might meet some nice people at this training thing, and then when it was over, there'd be some time to party with them. She wondered what the director of the training center, Paul Holt, would be like. She hoped he wouldn't be a jerk. Ted had said he had known him from working with him several summers before. "Hey, Teddy buddy," Jeff hollered into the phone. "We just rolled in." "Huh? Yeah, Sandra's here. You coming down to get us or what?" Jeff looked at her with a wry expression. After all the talk about picking them up in town and guiding them back to the training center to keep them from getting lost, now it seemed like Ted couldn't come and meet them after all. "Okay, give me the directions," Jeff said with resignation as he started scribbling them down. Sandra noticed an old man coming toward them pushing an old bicycle. He looked like a real geek. His body was like a scarecrow, and his face was grizzled with stubble. He wore a battered old felt hat and a dark green-stained work shirt with a ratty-looking vest and shapeless slacks. His bicycle looked almost as bad as he did. It looked as if he had picked it up from a trash heap. It was all rattly and rusty. The paint was chipped and the handlebars were twisted. The fenders were rubbing on the wheels. The chain guard was loose and the seat was worn clean through. As the old man came toward them, Sandra nudged Jeff to take a look at him. Jeff glanced at him quickly, grinned at her, then went back listening to Ted. Right, he said, repeating the directions as he scribbled them down. "Out on the north road right after the first fork. Look for a Dairy Queen. Left over a covered bridge." The old man hesitated when he passed them, and a strange look came over his face. He glanced at Jeff, and then he looked at Sandra, his eyes glazing over as if he were listening to something no one else could hear. His name was Ralph, and he was the town crazy. No one ever paid any attention to him except when he got drunk and careened around the town on his bicycle and preaching the gospel at the top of his lungs and threatening to veer out into traffic or crash through somebody's store window. He never seemed to make it around the corners of Harlan's hardware store, and he would inevitably smash into Harlan's front steps and wind up in a tangled heap pinned beneath his bike, writhing on the ground and screaming. Then someone would pay attention to him. Harlan would come running out and start jumping up and down and shouting at him, calling him names like sleazeball and egg sucker, and threatening to wrap that trashed-out bike around his scrawny neck. A crowd would usually gather, or as much as a crowd as you could get together in Crystal Lake, and the sheriff would have to come by and pull Harlan off Ralph and take Ralph down to the jail to dry out. It was always like that, the same routine. They paid attention to him when he had too much to drink, but they never paid attention to him when it really counted, when he tried to warn them. He had seen things out in the woods, and he knew what was going to happen if they started having kids out there again, if they started trespassing on his turf. Just like the last time, he thought, when he tried to tell them what would happen, and they didn't listen.
"I told the others,"
Ralph said, his voice hollow and eerie, his eyes bulging wildly as he approached Sandra and Jeff with maniac intensity.
"They didn't believe me. You're all doomed."
Sandra backed away from him uneasily. Jeff did a double take, not sure of how to react. But Ralph had already moved away. Jeff and Sandra exchanged glances, and Jeff sighed, rolled his eyes, and shook his head. "What?" he said, talking to Ted. "Oh, nothing. It was nothing. Go ahead. Wait a minute. Ted, slow down. Okay, so all right. Covered bridge. I got that. Then pass an old cemetery. Sandra looked at the ineligible way he was scrawling the directions and made a face. "We're never going to find the place," she muttered, looking around. Yeah, left," said Jeff. "Then a half-mile further on a dirt road." "Oh my God," said Sandra, noticing for the first time the big black wrecker that had pulled up to their pickup truck. "They're towing us!" Jeff spun around and saw that the driver of the wrecker already had the pickup hoisted and was walking toward the door and preparing to drive off. "Ted, I'll call you back," Jeff shouted into the receiver and then dropped it, leaving it dangling as he ran with Sandra to the truck. Hey! He yelled as the truck driver started up the wrecker. "Hey, wait!" If the driver heard or saw them, he paid no attention. He shifted the wrecker into first and slowly pulled away, towing their pickup truck behind him. "Hey! Stop! Hey!" shouted Jeff, chasing the wrecker. "It's my truck you're towing! Hey, asshole!" "You can't do this!" Sandra cried, running hard to keep up with Jeff. "All of our stuff is in there!" Jeff caught up to the truck and started banging on the driver's window, but the man stared straight ahead with a deadpan expression. Hey, asshole!" Jeff yelled, trying to stay even with the truck. The driver could easily have pulled away, but he continued on at a pace just fast enough to make Jeff and Sandra have to run hard to keep up, but not so fast as to leave them behind. He drove the wrecker off the main street and down a tree-lined residential avenue, speeding up a bit as Jeff and Sandra struggled to keep up. Then suddenly he pulled up in front of a large Victorian house and stopped. Jeff and Sandra came to a halt, out of breath, completely taken aback at the sight of Ted standing on the front lawn and grinning at them with his hands on his hips. "Welcome to God's country," Ted said, laughing. For a moment, both Jeff and Sandra stared at him. Then realization dawned and they charged him, shaking and pummeling him playfully. "You little rat shit," said Jeff. "You set us up." Ted laughed and waved to the driver of the wrecker, who was winching down their pickup and grinning at them. "Thanks, Max." Max gave them a wink. "Max owns the station. He's crazy, too." "I should have known," said Sandra, punching him on the shoulder. "It's great that you guys could make it," Ted said, putting his arms around them. "It's gonna be like old times." "That's what I'm afraid of," Jeff said, laughing. He remembered only too well what it had been like the summer they had spent together before they had gone off to different schools. Ted hadn't changed at all. He was still as skinny as a beanpole. He still wore loud clothes like the yellow checkered shirt he had on, and he still played practical jokes. Come on, help me load my gear," said Ted. "We'll split for the camp." They helped Ted carry his pack and duffel bags to the pickup and toss them in the back. Then they piled in and Ted directed them on the road through Crystal Lake and out of town. "So, what's the scoop?" said Jeff as they left town and headed down a winding country lake road that led towards the lake. Sandra sat between the two of them, watching the scenery and working the radio. Ted was hunched up against the door, his hand on the outside of the truck drumming a beat in time to the music. "Well, I know the guy who runs the course," he said. "He's okay, kind of macho though, you know. He takes the whole thing very seriously. We'll probably get a brownie badge to wear." He dropped his voice theatrically. "If we survive." "If we survive?" Sandra exclaimed, looking at Ted. "Oh, I didn't tell you," Ted said innocently. "I'm going to be second assistant." "Oh, God," Jeff and Sandra both said at once, rolling their eyes in mock horror. After a while, they turned off the country road and headed up a narrow, graded dirt road, leading back into the woods. It was barely wide enough for two vehicles to pass each other, even if they went very slowly and carefully. Ted was rattling off a series of bad jokes when Jeff came around a turn and slammed on the brakes. "So the bear wiped his ass with the rabbit." Sandra had to straight-arm the dashboard to keep from getting thrown forward. "What the hell is that?" he said, looking out through the windshield. There was a large dead tree limb blocking the road, but there weren't any trees on the side of the road big enough to have dropped a limb that size. There were just small pines and oaks and scrub brush. "Where'd that sucker come from?" Jeff said, getting out of the truck. Ted led Sandra out and then slammed the door, coming around the front of the truck to examine the tree limb. It was too big to drive over. They'd wind up dragging it along with them if they tried, and Jeff wasn't about to risk ruining the undercarriage of his brand new truck. He stood there staring at it and shaking his head. Ted shrugged and bent down to grab the tree limb by a thick branch that was sticking out. He grunted as he tried to move it. It was a hell of a lot heavier than it looked. Come on, give me a hand." "It looks like somebody dragged it out here," Jeff said, pointing to some drag marks by the side of the road. As they both bent down to move the tree limb, Sandra wandered off the road and down a narrow path she'd spotted. She'd thought at first that it might be an animal run. She knew that dense woods were not the best place to look for wildlife because animals needed a greater variety of vegetation like that found in clearings, near rivers and streams, and at the edge of forests. Animals were creatures of habit, and they commonly used the same routes called trails and runs to get their feeding and watering areas. New ones were barely noticeable, being a little more than pushed-down undergrowth that could easily escape a casual glance. Older ones had been trampled down often enough to kill some of the undergrowth and leave a narrow dirt path. Initially, Sandra thought she had spotted a very old run because the path was well-traveled and worn and deeper in the center than at the edges. At first, she became excited, knowing that there would be deer in this country as well as bears. But on closer examination, as she walked a bit further into the woods, she realized that it wasn't an animal run after all. It was a path that had been worn by people, only it was becoming overgrown. She noticed a piece of white painted wood laying in some bushes and bent down to pick it up. Hey you guys, she called. "Take a look at this." Working together, Ted and Jeff had managed to heave the tree limb into the bushes. They jogged down the overgrown trail after her. Sandra stood looking down at the remains of an old sign. It was splintered at the edges, and the white paint was cracked and peeling. The faded black letters on it read, "Camp Crystal Lake." Ted exhaled softly. "Camp Blood," he said in a low voice. Jeff and Sandra both looked at him questioningly. This place is on the same lake that we're going to be," Ted said, looking around uneasily. "Camp Blood?" said Jeff. Sandra stared at the sign, frowning. There was something familiar about that name, but she couldn't place it. It seemed to her that she had heard something about a place known as Camp Blood. She thought she could remember a newspaper article about some murders that had taken place at a summer camp. "Wasn't this the camp?" she started, but Ted cut her off. "Come on," he said, taking the sign from her and tossing it into the bushes. "We're gonna be late." "Can't we take a look?" said Sandra, gazing back down the path, wanting to see what the old place looked like. "No way," said Ted, staring back down the path toward the truck, anxious to get away. Jeff and Sandra exchanged glances and started after him. "What's the problem?" Jeff said. "You don't want to hear about it, man," said Ted. "Believe me, not before lunch." He seemed in a hurry to get back to the truck. Sandra looked at Jeff and shrugged. Ted's mood seemed to have changed very suddenly. It was clear that he didn't want to stay there, and it was just as clear that he didn't want to talk about it. They got back into the truck and started off down the road again. Ted seemed unusually quieter as they drove away. Behind them, a twig cracked on the trail as a heavy work boot stepped on it. The watcher moved some branches aside in order to look after the departing truck. He breathed heavily as old memories surged up within him. They were twisted memories that were like snakes in his unhinged mind. As he watched them leave, he decided he would see them again very soon. Okay, Slashaholics, this has been Chapter 2 of Friday the 13th, Part 2, the novelization of the film by Simon Hawke. Not a whole lot of stuff going down in this chapter, but we did get to meet Crazy Ralph, which, by the way, was voiced by one of my patrons, Christopher. Thank you so much. He's known as Willow Ravenwood in the Patreon credits. Thank you so much, Christopher Burns. You did a great job. Sorry that Ralph didn't have as many lines as he did in the first book. Anyways, so yeah, this chapter was mainly just introducing a few of our characters, Jeff, Sandra, and of course, everybody's favorite, jokester, Ted. And he pulls a pretty good prank on his friends here, having the truck towed and everything. I did enjoy that. I wish we'd got a little more Ralph in the book than we did in the movie. But it was kind of cool to hear how he's like an attention hound in Crystal Lake. And, I did enjoy the three of them coming upon the tree in the road, obviously put there by someone, the Watcher, whoever he is. I have no idea. I don't want this spoiled. Nobody tell me who the Watcher is. Anyways, I did enjoy her finding the sign. Always a great little scene. And as they drove away, the whole thing with the Watcher, stepping on a twig and seeing them leave and deciding that he was going to see them again really soon. I'm really excited for this book. I think it's going to be a lot better than the first Friday the 13th novel by Simon Hawke was. I think his hands were tied a lot in that one, not being able to talk about the killer or get into the killer's head. I'm a little bit worried that he's going to be in the same restraints in this book, but maybe not as much. Because it has said he more than once, so, who knows. We got into the killer's head at least more in this last scene than we did the entire time before the Pamela reveal in the first book. So I really don't know where this book's going to go. I'm interested to find out, and I hope you are too. I'll be back very soon with more of Friday the 13th, Part 2 by Simon Hawke. Until then, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying, thanks for listening. Be excellent to each other, and I'll see you soon. Oh, click that thumbs up button. You don't want to click that thumbs down button because...
it's got a death curse!